Welcome. You are about to view a recorded talk of the Progress and Visions in Consciousness Science online seminar series. This series is organised jointly by the Association for Mathematical Consciousness Science, AMCS, the Mediterranean Society for Consciousness Science, and the Oxford Mathematics of Consciousness Network. While every session consists of a talk and discussions, the latter are not recorded and the following will only contain the talk. We hope you will enjoy it. Further information and details on how to join are available on our website.
Truly excited and honored to have Nick Humphrey today to speak in our Progress and Visions seminar. About 6 months ago, I listened to a YouTube talk that Nick gave at the Royal Institution on evolution of consciousness. And even though he was speaking about warm-blooded animals, I found that what he said resonated with our thoughts on consciousness in no-blooded machines. So I emailed him, and he generously replied, and which started a fun correspondence. Really enjoyed that. Nick is a neuropsychologist, well known for his work on evolution of primate intelligence and consciousness. He studied mountain gorillas with Diane Fossey in Rwanda. He was the first to demonstrate the existence of blindsight in monkeys, work he started as a PhD student at Cambridge. I hope he will tell us a bit about his work with Helen. Nick's interests and activities include public policy and public understanding of science. He became active in the anti-nuclear movement in the 70s, and he co-edited an anthology on War and Peace called In a Dark Time, which was awarded the Martin Luther King Award Memorial Prize. He produced a number of TV and radio documentaries. He has published about 10 books dealing with consciousness in the mind, including his recent book, Sentience. And there was a lovely piece entitled Nicholas Humphrey's Beautiful Theory of Mind in the New Yorker last year, which you can Google, and I think it's up for everybody. And so fitting, he's told me that he's currently working on a book on aesthetics. So maybe he'll tell us a bit about that as well, how that's coming. Okay, Nick, all yours.
Leonard, thanks very much. I probably won't get to that topic, but let's see how it goes. I'm going to talk for about, let's say, 45, 50 minutes, and that'll be a fairly formal talk. I've got a lot to go through, and I want to show a lot of slides to illustrate it. So I probably won't take interruptions as we go along unless you really shout at me. But I'll expect to have a free run, and let's have a good discussion at the end of it. So my talk is, as you'll see, you can see the slide evolving sentience. Yep.
Yes.
So I hardly need to tell you that these days the word sentience is on everybody's lips. The United Kingdom government has passed a law declaring that lobsters are legally sentient. Wise men and women worry that artificial intelligence may be becoming sentient. Respected philosophers suggest that the whole universe may be sentient. So what are people talking about when they ask whether lobsters or chatbots or the Andromeda Nebula is sentient? If you ask for a definition, people tend to avoid your eye. Nonetheless, it's pretty clear that what really concerns them is the question of phenomenal consciousness. Do any entities other than humans feel their own existence in the way that we do? Do they experience the qualia of conscious sensation? Well, I believe as a scientist that there has to be a fact of the matter about this. Phenomenal consciousness is a biological phenomenon with clear physical boundaries. Animals either have it or they don't. It can't just be a matter of opinion. Even so, I believe it's a more extraordinary biological phenomenon than most scientists and philosophers have ever imagined, and I expect that's true of everyone attending this seminar. I'm going to begin with a bit of personal history. The cover of the New Scientist magazine in 1972 showed a picture of a rhesus monkey with the headline, "A blind monkey that sees everything." The monkey, named Helen, was part of a study led by my PhD supervisor, Larry Weiskrantz, in the psychology lab in Cambridge. A few years earlier, he had surgically removed the primary visual cortex at the back of Helen's brain. When I first met Helen a year after the operation, it seemed that the loss of cortex had in fact made her completely blind. But something puzzled me. In mammals, There are two main pathways from the eye to the brain, an evolutionary ancient one, going from the descendants of the visual system used by fish and frogs and reptiles, which goes from the optic to the optic tectum in the midbrain. And then a newer one that goes up to the cortex. In Helen, the cortical pathway had been surgically removed, eliminated, but the ancient visual system, this midbrain one, was of course still intact. Now, if a frog can see using the optic tectum, why not Helen? While Weisskranz was away at the conference, I took the chance to investigate further. I simply sat with Helen and played with her, offering her treats for any attempt to engage with me by sight. To my delight, she began to respond. Within a few hours, I had her reaching out to take pieces of apple from my hand. Within a week, she was reaching out to touch a small flashing light. 7 years later, she was running around a complex arena, deftly avoiding obstacles, picking up peanuts from the floor. An extended clip, I've just had it remastered. It's actually much better than it was now. This is Helen, 7 years after I started working with her. She was, when I first met her, she was blind, uninterested in vision, completely despondent about using her eyes. This is how she was by this point. And you'll see, you might indeed think her vision was completely normal. Dan Dennett and I showed this film once to a group in Columbia, a philosophy group, and asked them why we were showing the film. And they said, well, don't know, it's a normal monkey, isn't it? Here's a point you might attend to, just in case Helen was using echolocation. I'd put a baffle which was transparent. She bumped straight into it. All this time, there is in fact white noise playing in the distance so that she's not able to use auditory cues. Now, you'll note, compared with human blindsight, I'll come on to that, Helen is remarkably proactive. She spontaneously uses vision. She seems to know what she wants and what she's doing. And the extent of her vision was not only highly acute, but she also had surprisingly good three-dimensional vision. No question, I think, that she was using binocular vision in some of these tests, which is all the more surprising since, sorry, let me get back to that. It's all the more surprising because, okay, no, that was in fact a short piece, because the mechanism of three-dimension vision, three binocular vision discovered by Hubel and Wiesel, of course, lies in V1 of the visual cortex, and Helen didn't have it. So, good question, however, was she able to do this? Okay, now, as I said, to anyone who'd observed Helen in 1972 and who didn't know the history, it might have seemed that her eyesight was quite normal. Yet, could she in fact see everything, as the cover of the New Scientist implied? I myself didn't really believe so. I found it hard to put my finger on what was missing, but my hunch was that Helen still doubted that she could see. She seemed strangely unsure of herself. If she was upset or frightened, her confidence would desert her, and she'd stumble about as if in the dark again. The title I gave to my essay inside the next slide I want. Title I gave to my essay inside the New Scientist wasn't a blind monkey that can see everything. It was seeing and nothingness. We were on the brink of a remarkable discovery, and I'm sure you know where it was going. Following on from the findings with Helen, Larry Weisskranz took a new approach with a human patient, DB as he was known. DB had undergone surgery to remove a growth affecting the visual cortex on the left side of his brain. The operation had rendered him completely blind across the right-hand half of his field of vision. DB himself maintained that he had no visual awareness in the affected area. Weisskranz, however, now decided not to take DB's word for it, and overcoming DB's protests, he asked him to guess what he would be seeing if he could see. To everyone's surprise, it turned out that he could in fact guess both the location and the shape of an object to which he believed that he was blind. DB himself was the most surprised of all. To him, this success in guessing seemed quite unreasonable. So far as he was concerned, he wasn't the source of his perceptual judgments. His sight had nothing to do with him. Weisskranz named this capacity blind sight. Now, blind sight is now a well-established clinical phenomenon. However, when first discovered, it seemed theoretically quite shocking. A patient with blind sight has no visual sensation of the light arriving at his eye, yet he's still able to use the visual information to perceive the existence of objects out there in the world. No one had ever expected there could be any such dissociation between sensation and perception. Yet, as I ruminated on the implications of this for understanding consciousness, I found myself doing a double take. Perhaps the real puzzle isn't so much the absence of sensations in blind sight as the presence of sensations in normal sight. If blind sight is seeing and nothingness, normal sight is seeing and somethingness. And surely it's the nature of this extra something that we have to explain. Why do sensations have the mysterious feel they do? Why is there any such thing as what philosophers call phenomenal experience, our subjective, personal sense of interacting with the stimuli arriving at our sense organs? Not only in the case of vision, of course, but across all sensory modalities. How we experience the redness of red, the saltiness of salt, the paininess of pain. What does the extra phenomenal dimension amount to, and what's the use of it? Now, sensations, let's be clear, have a different remit from perceptions. Both are forms of mental representation. They are ideas generated by the brain. But they are about very different kinds of things. Perception is about what's happening out there in the external world. The apple is red, the rock is hard, the bird is singing. By contrast, sensation is personal. It's about what's happening to me and how I, as a subject, evaluate it. The pain is in my toe, and it's horrible. The sweet taste is on my tongue, and sickly. The red light is before my eyes, and it's stirring me up. It's as if, in having sensations, we're both registering the objective fact of stimulation and expressing our personal bodily opinion about it. And as I'll explain shortly, I think that's just what we are doing. But why do it this way? What makes the subjective present created by sensations seem so rich and deep, as if we're living in what I've called thick time? What can the artist Kandinsky mean? What can Kandinsky mean when he writes that color is a power which directly influences the human soul? Color is the keyboard, the eyes are the hammers, the soul is the piano with many strings. Why indeed do we use the strange expression, it's like something, to experience sensations? Is it because sensations are like something they can't really be? Well, in asking these questions, we're up against the so-called hard problem of consciousness. How a physical brain could possibly underwrite the extra physical properties of phenomenal experience. As the neuroscientist Christoph Koch once wrote to me, it's such a mystery, it seems to call for God. Well, for 50 years, I've been searching for an answer that doesn't require God. From the start, I've been suspicious of the theories that attempt to identify the neural correlate of consciousness. Many theorists continue to believe that conscious states are identical to brain states. And for them, the obvious and best approach to the problem is to search for brain events that have phenomenal properties built into their physical structure. This is actually quite an old idea. Going back to the 1909 Encyclopedia Britannica, you'd find the entrance on consciousness. You could read about the so-called psychonic theory. 1929. One theory holds that each atom of the physical body possesses an inherent attribute of consciousness. If each atom emanates its own consciousness, then the self must actually consist of an amalgam of all these tiny units, of awareness. Well, today, of course, the language has moved on, though you may recognize some ideas there. At last year's big conference on the science of consciousness in Taormina, there was a consciousness challenge, and participants were invited to vote on which theory is the most convincing solution to the problem of consciousness. Well, the psychonic theory as such didn't feature among the 18 theories on offer, yet several of the popular theories were very near neighbors of it. Integrated information theory, for example, postulates, and this is a recent quote from Koch, that there's a complete one-to-one mapping between any experience and all of its phenomenal distinctions and relations on the one hand, and the causal structure that's identical to it and that's unfolded from its physical substrate on the other hand. Well, wow, it's a perfect explanation, you might think. It's been described as the mathematically most sophisticated theory of consciousness. Yet I believe myself that this and all other physical identity theories, that they've got off on the wrong foot. They were and are attempts to explain how phenomenal properties could be properties of a brain process. But I think this rests on a fundamental misunderstanding of what it is we're trying to explain. Sensations, as I said a moment ago, are not material entities. They are ideas. They're the way your brain represents what's happening at your sense organs and how you feel about it. This means we have to explain their properties, not literally as the properties of brain states, but rather as the properties of mind states dreamed up by the brain. And once we see this to be the task, I think much of the difficulty and mystery falls away. As with any kind of representation, we can assume that representing sensations has to involve a two-stage process. In the case of seeing red, for example, there will be one, the physical vehicle, the vehicle that carries the information about how the brain evaluates the light arriving at the eyes. And secondly, there'll be the cognitive operation that interprets this as the idea of phenomenal redness. Now, by analogy, let's consider a work of literature, say the novel Moby Dick. Here, there will be the text that carries the information about the words penned by the author, and then there'll also be the cognitive operation that interprets these as a story about a white whale. But let's note that there's nothing in the physical text that's white or whale-like. And so by the same token, I think we can presume there's going to be nothing in the brain's physical response to light that is actually phenomenally red. Here, let me show it to you a different way. Here's first the book. So we have the written text, then we have the reading of the text, and then we have the interpretation of it as the story of a white whale. Now let's go to the brain, seeing red. Here we have the brain text, then there's the reading of it, and then the interpretation of this as of a phenomenally red sensation. The actual redness isn't in the brain. It's just the idea of redness, the way we interpret what we're seeing, the text. So what's this mean for a genuine science of consciousness? I think it means our task is to work out just how the brain achieves this remarkable feat of representation. And the way I've approached this has been by way of forward engineering. Let me go back. I'll come to that in a moment. What I've called forward engineering. That's to say, I've begun with the end product, sensations as humans experience them today. But rather than treating this, as theorists typically do, as something to deconstruct, I've treated it as something to invent. I've tried to come up with an evolutionary sequence that can get us from nothingness to somethingness, from the blind sight of our remote ancestors to the fully phenomenal sight we humans enjoy today. And the sequence I've arrived at has several twists and turns. I suggested just now that when we have a sensation, it's rather as if we're expressing our personal bodily opinion about the sensory stimulus. And in fact, that's just how I see things starting out in evolution. I believe sensations originated as active behavioral responses to stimuli arriving at the body surface. They were something the subject did about the stimulation long before they evolved to be something the subject felt about it. So coming to this slide, here's a primitive amoeba-like animal floating in the ancient seas. Stuff happens to it. Light falls on its body, pressure waves press against it, chemicals stick to it. Some of these events are going to be good for the animal, and others are going to be bad. If it's to survive, it must evolve the ability to sort out the good from the bad and to respond appropriately, reacting to one stimulus with an ouch, to another with a whoopee. I call these expressive responses that evaluate input sentition. It's meant to be a mixture between sensation and volition. To start with, sentition, these responses are entirely local responses, as I show there, organized around the site of stimulation. When, say, red light falls on the animal makes a characteristic wiggle of activity. It wriggles redly. When salt arrives, it makes a different kind of wriggle. It wriggles saltedly. Before long, the responses come to be mediated by a central ganglion, or proto-brain. Now, presumably, sentition has been designed by natural selection to be adaptive, with each response taking account of what kind of stimulus is reaching the body's surface and what import it has for the animal's well-being. Thus, even from the earliest stage, we could say the animal is enacting what the stimulation means to it. Yet to begin with, the responses are entirely reflex, and none of this meaning is being held in mind. Let's imagine, however, that as the animal's life becomes more complex, it reaches a stage where it would benefit from retaining some kind of mental record of what's affecting it, a representation of the stimulus that can serve as a basis for planning and decision-making. And it turns out there's a very neat way of doing this. To discover what's happening to me, the animal has only to monitor what I'm doing about it. And it can do this by the simple trick of creating a copy of the command signals through these responses. An efference copy that can be read in reverse, as it were, to recreate the meaning of the stimulation. In short, the animal can begin to get a feel for the stimulus by accessing the information already implicit in its own response. And this, I believe, is the precursor of subjective sensation. But of course, it won't at first be sensation as we humans know it. It won't have any special phenomenal quality. The key to acquiring phenomenal properties lies in how sentition goes on evolving. In the early days, it involves actual bodily behavior out in the open. But there must come a time when such overt behavior is no longer appropriate. The animal no longer wants to recoil reflexly from red light, for example, but it still wants to register that red light is falling on its body and that it feels menacing. So what's to be done? The solution natural selection hits on is ingenious. It's for the responses to become internalized or privatized. What happens is that the command signals, rather than bringing about actual motor behavior, begin to target the internal body map where the sense organs project to the brain. In this way, sentition evolves to be a virtual bodily response. It's still an activity that can be read to provide a mental representation of the stimulation that elicits it. Now, as luck would have it, the privatization has a wonderful result. To illustrate what happens, let me switch to something more like a human brain. Here we have sentition, the evaluative bodily response going down to the body from motor cortex here. Here's the efference copy, being monitored by what I call the proto-self, the new subject of sensation. And here now, the response is being privatized. Well, what's the result? It leads to a feedback loop between motor and sensory regions of the brain, a loop with the potential to sustain recursive activity, going round and round, catching its own tail. And I believe this development is game-changing. Crucially, it means the activity can be drawn out in time so as to give rise to the thick moment of sensation. But more than this, the activity can be channeled and stabilized so as to create a mathematically complex attractor state, a dynamic pattern of activity that recreates itself. Such an attractor, and you mathematicians will know much more about them than I do, such an attractor can, in theory, have remarkable hyperdimensional properties. Real, unreal, magical, the answer is going to be in the eye of the beholder. Small adjustments to the circuitry will result in dramatic changes to the attractor's shape, with corresponding changes in the subjective experience of the self which is monitoring. And upshot, at least in the line that led to humans, is, I think, the creation of a very special kind of attractor, one the subject reads as having the feel of phenomenal qualia. This attractor is still a type of sentition, which originates as a response to sensory stimulation and still carries information about what's happening to me. But the information now comes in a remarkable new package. It comes, if you like, as part of a riddle written on the brain. Arguably, the brain has in fact evolved to methodically bamboozle the mind. So there we are. I want to say job done. Of course, this is only the story in outline, and no doubt it's only partly right at best. But I'm convinced that every step is actually a plausible evolutionary development, and it leads to an end state that could, in principle, be responsible for phenomenal consciousness as we humans know it, and as other sentient animals, such as exist, must surely know it too. Out of this, we get the kinds of representation in response to sensory stimulation that I set out to try and explain. But I acknowledge, of course, that if this is an explanation of how sentience evolved, the story is still far from complete. For we still have to explain why. What's it all for? What can have driven these evolutionary developments, and those final stages in particular? What can have been the biological advantage of having sensations dressed up in this wonderfully exotic way? Is phenomenal consciousness actually for anything? There are a good many theorists quite willing and even happy to answer no. To quote philosopher Jerry Fodor, consciousness, he says, seems to be, he means phenomenal consciousness seems to be among the chronically unimplied. As far as anybody knows, anything that our conscious minds can do, they could do just as well if they weren't conscious. Why then did God bother to make consciousness? What on earth could he have had in mind? Well, I won't presume to answer on behalf of God, but I will try to answer on behalf of natural selection. To explain the use of phenomenal experience, I suggest we can and should let our own first-person intuitions be our guide. Who can know better than you do or I do what sentience is for? So ask yourself, what would be missing from your life if you lacked phenomenal consciousness, if you had blind sight, blind touch, blind hearing, blind everything? I think there's an obvious and true answer, and it's the one I touched on already when discussing blind sight. It's that what would be missing would be you, yourself. As I remarked earlier, one of the most striking facts about human patients with blind sight is that they don't take ownership of their capacity to see. Lacking sensations, visual sensations with phenomenal properties, lacking the somethingness of seeing, they believe that their manifest capacity for visual perception has nothing to do with them. Then imagine what it would be like if you were to lack phenomenal consciousness, phenomenal experience of any kind at all, if you were to believe that none of your sensory experience was owned by you. Presumably, yourself would disappear. Well, of course, I'm not alone in saying this. The Scottish philosopher David Hume was in no doubt that sensations provided the basis for selfhood. Here in a famous passage, he wrote, "For my part, when I enter most intimately into what I call myself, I always stumble on some particular sensation or other of heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred, pain or pleasure. When my sensations are removed for any time as by sound sleep, I may truly be said not to exist. So remove phenomenal experience and the self ceases to exist. But by the same token, install or reinstall it and the self leaps back into existence. Let's think back then again to that point deep in the past when natural selection first breathed life into the loops in your ancestors' brains, and they woke up to find themselves transformed into sentient, self-conscious beings. In reality, of course, it won't have happened in a flash, but I don't think it need have been a gradual process either. For the fact is that attractors have an all-or-nothing character. So the phenomenalization of sensations could have come about quite rapidly, perhaps within a few hundred generations. Whenever it occurred, it will certainly have been a psychological and social watershed. With this marvelous new phenomenon at the core of your being, you will have begun to matter to yourself in a new and deeper way. You'll have come to believe as never before in your own singular significance. And it won't just be you, for you'll soon recognize that other members of your species probably possess conscious selves like yours, so you'll be led to respect their individual worth as well. I feel, therefore I am. And you feel, therefore you are too. In fact, you'll soon make a remarkable discovery. It's that when you imagine yourself in your fellow creature's place, you can model in yourself what they are feeling. In short, phenomenal consciousness will have become your ticket to having a theory of mind and living in what I've called the society of selves. So we come to the big question. If this account is anything like right, what's it say about the distribution of phenomenal consciousness across the animal kingdom? I've shown some chimps here in my slide. No one could doubt that they are sentient. But among the huge variety of other non-human animals alive today, which species are likely to have crossed the line to sentience? What I want to know next is how far sentience of the kind I've described would in fact have evolved in the animal kingdom, because it's going to depend on two crucial considerations. Firstly, the kind of brain the animal has, which can support those feedback loops, and secondly, and very importantly, on the kind of life that the animal leads. First of all, there won't have been any physiological means for generating phenomenal experience unless the animal has a brain that can house sensory motor feedback loops capable of creating attractors of the kind I've described. And second, there'll have been no evolutionary incentive for the animal to acquire these attractors unless it has a lifestyle in which possession of a phenomenally enriched sense of self can in fact enhance its personal and social survival. And this leads me to a surprising and I think possibly unwelcome conclusion. It means, I think, that sentience must be a rather recent evolutionary innovation. By far the majority of animals on Earth have neither the brains nor the use for it. In fact, to stick my neck out, I'll be more specific. I suspect that sentience may not have arrived until the evolution of warm-blooded animals, as Lenore mentioned at the start. Warm-blooded animals, mammals, and birds, only around 200 million years ago. Now, I draw the line there for two reasons. The invention of warm-bloodedness had two major effects, both on animals' lifestyles and on their brains. To start with, it made animals relatively independent of environmental conditions. Cold-blooded animals not only have to stay within relatively narrow geographic limits, but they have their activity levels dictated from moment to moment by the ambient temperature. As the sun sets or goes behind a cloud, the body of a cold-blooded animal, such as a lizard, chills, and its muscles and nerves slow down. By contrast, warm-blooded animals take their environment with them. and so can be alert and active, feeding, socializing, traveling, both by day and night, winter and summer, high in the mountains or down on the plains. Now, as the bodies of warm-blooded animals became more self-reliant and self-contained, I imagine their sense of self did too. After millions of years in which their ancestors had had their lives constrained by environmental temperatures, they found themselves let off the leash. In body and mind, they became increasingly autonomous agents, able with the freedom to go where they would and do what they wanted. Suddenly, a huge constraint on selfhood had been lifted. But that's only half the story. For just at the time when warm-bloodedness was increasing animals' sense of having an individualized self, it would also have been having a dramatic effect on their brains. And the reason is that the conduction speed of nerve cells increases with temperature. Here's a graph of how it changes in a human's finger. But all nerve cells behave this way, including brain cells. This means that as body temperature increases from an average of, say, 15 degrees centigrade in cold-blooded animals to a steady 37 degrees in mammals and 40 degrees in birds, the speed of nerve cells in the brain will have nearly tripled. Because this will have reduced the time lag in any feedback loops, it will have made recurrent activation much more likely to occur. And I suggest this could have been just what was needed to fire up the attractor states. Turn up the temperature, and bingo, the activity takes off and the phenomenal self emerges. What I found astonishing in researching this is that almost nobody comments on this extraordinary change from cold to warm-blooded animals and what effect it must have had on cognition and brain activity. Okay, this is all speculation, and it's time to ask, where's the evidence about the reach of sentience in the animal kingdom? It's sometimes said we shouldn't expect there to be any evidence of it. Sentience is all on the inside and is invisible to external observers. But of course, that can't be right. If sentience has indeed evolved, natural selection must have been able to recognize the effects it was having at the level of behavior, effects that increased the animal's chances of survival. And if natural selection was able to see those effects in the past, presumably behavioral scientists should be able to do so today. Well, I don't have time to expand on this at any length. To whet your appetite, I'll show a few film clips that I think bear on the evidence I discuss in the book. These are the questions I'm going to ask. Hang on a minute. Do animals, so I propose a variety of ways. Sorry, I'm going to go back a bit on this. Sorry, I missed my page. So where should we be looking for evidence of sentience? I've been arguing that phenomenal consciousness gives an animal a competitive advantage, specifically because of its psychological effects, the way it changes how the animal thinks. Firstly, about what it's like to be me, and secondly, about what it's like to be you. In my new book, Sentience, which Leonore referred to, I propose a variety of ways in which this is likely to show up in behavior. And I ask, do animals, one, have a robust sense of self centered on sensory experience? Do they engage in self-pleasuring activities, sensations for sensation's sake? Do they have notions of I and you as mirror selves? Do they carry their sense of their own identity forward? And perhaps most of all, do they lend out their minds so as to understand the feelings of others? Well, there's no time to go into all that in detail, but I'm going to whet your appetite by a few examples which I've taken from the internet, and which I discuss in the book. Here we have a chimpanzee exploring his body as seen in a mirror. Hard to believe that he doesn't have a sense of self. Here, quite differently, some picture of some swans going for a joyride, pure sensation seeking. Hard to believe that these animals don't enjoy sensations for sensation's sake. Here's a dog doing something similar. And he goes up and down and up and down with the sledge, but I'm not going to show you all of it. Here's something rather different. An elephant showing, a group of elephants showing empathy for an individual in trouble. Those elephants apparently clearly know what it's like to be the infant, and they're reacting accordingly. And here's a person doing something rather similar. Human being in relation to an animal. This boy is putting himself in the deer's place, and he knows what to do, lending out his own mind. Here are some magpies grieving over the death of a companion. I'm sorry, I think the sound's not on this recording, but they're wailing and screeching, clearly upset and confused by what's happening to their dead friend. Here's a different example, a chimpanzee giving pleasure to another one. Dad playing with his son. And here's my final example. Here are examples of two warm-blooded animals of the classes which I think are most significant, mammals and birds. Now, looking at that, I think it's very hard not to believe that the dog has a sense of what it's like to be the bird, and the magpie has a sense of what it's like to be a dog. But I don't think you see that in any other animals other than mammals and birds. I'd agree, of course, that no particular example can seal the deal here, but they do add together, and I reckon the balance of evidence supports my hunch that it is only mammals and birds that make the cut. Chimpanzees, dogs, parrots, magpies are all, they all affirm their selfhood in ways like this. Lobsters, lizards, frogs really don't. We look more closely at Bruegel's painting of animals waiting to be invited aboard Noah's Ark. You'll see that all except this one are warm-blooded. He didn't put any cold-blooded pictures, any animals into his picture. Perhaps Bruegel knew something that we didn't only discover recently. He's painted, I think, the kingdom of sentience. But what about those octopuses? They are everybody's favorite candidate for an outlying species that is sentient. And I have to say, I think the behavioral evidence simply contradicts this. Octopuses are undoubtedly highly intelligent. Yet, on the face of it, octopuses don't find pleasure in sensation seeking. They don't have a strong sense of themselves as individuals. They don't attribute selfhood to others, and nor do they care. In fact, I guess that sentience would be wasted in octopuses. Suppose we could, in fact, genetically engineer an octopus to have phenomenal consciousness. I'm pretty sure that the newfound selfhood would make little or no difference to the octopus's survival, so the new genes would not be maintained by selection and soon would disappear. But for all these other animals, sentience made a real difference. Given the life an octopus leads, I don't think it would have any advantage worth talking about. Okay, well, it's time to wrap up this talk, and I want to return to the case of Helen and frogs. Many years ago, I wrote a paper titled What the Frog's Eye Tells the Monkey's Brain. I think it's time to consider now what a monkey's blindsight tells us about frogs. So let's look at it. Here's on the right, I'm going to get it again. There's Helen reaching for peanuts on the left. And here's a frog reaching, flicking out for virtual ants on an iPhone. Both animals are, I think, both animals certainly are using the same subcortical visual system of their brains. Helen has only got a frog's visual system left. And look at how the obvious similarity. Now, with Helen, poor blind-sighted Helen, there's obviously good reason to assume that despite her obvious visual competence, there was nothing it's like for her to see. And I conclude that equally, there's nothing it's like for the frog to see. And I think the same goes, or the frog to feel pain, or the frog to hear. And I think the same goes for most animals on Earth. Look at it again. This frog, I think, has blindsight, just like Helen does. Okay, but that's not my last word. If I can have another 5 minutes, I'm going to make a significant concession. When I argue that animals such as frogs are insentient, I don't mean necessarily that they're not conscious at all. Indeed, I've come around to thinking that many insentient animals probably are conscious, but conscious in a more robotic, zombie-like way. Now, I'll need to unpack this. As you know, the term consciousness, as used by cognitive scientists, has a technical meaning that has nothing to do with phenomenal experience or sentience. Rather, it has to do simply with how the brain manages information. For you to be cognitively conscious, means nothing more or less than that you, the subject, have introspective access to mental states, that you know what's in your mind. The best known model for this for cognitive consciousness, which I'm pretty sure is right, suggests that there's a central processing unit in the brain that has access to a global workspace where a current set of mental representations are on display. The central processor, having an overview of the workspace, is able to collate and integrate information across different domains so as to allow intelligent judgments and decisions to be made on behalf of the whole system. As such, cognitive consciousness is an effective computational strategy. It streamlines the work of the brain, it resolves potential conflicts, and it gives coherence and direction to thoughts and actions. Now, because cognitive consciousness is relatively simple to engineer and it gets results, I think we can be sure that it will have been discovered by natural selection and installed in animals' brains long before any of them went on to become sentient. When and if it finally arrived, phenomenal consciousness will have been an extension to the kind of consciousness that already existed and was probably widespread in the animal kingdom. And so to sum up, I want to suggest now that there are in fact actually three classes of animals on the spectrum of consciousness. There's unconscious ones, such as worms and jellyfish, which I don't think have any sort of introspective access. They don't have a global workspace. Then there are the cognitively conscious, but not sentient creatures, for example, honeybees or octopuses, I think they do have a global workspace or something of that kind, and in fact they have introspective access to what's going on there. But they're not sentient. They haven't yet evolved the phenomenal dimension. And then thirdly, there are those who are cognitively conscious and sentient, and that includes parrots, dogs, humans, and so on, the mammals and birds I've talked about. But where does this leave blindsight in that case? If Helen was not visually sentient, could she still have been visually conscious? Even if she didn't feel the light at her eyes, did she still know the story she was getting about the external world? And could this introspective knowledge have continued to guide her thought? Well, I have to say this possibility has only recently occurred to me. But I've been back over the films I made of Helen, and I found telltale signs of her dithering mentally, apparently weighing up what course to follow. For example, as she approaches an obstacle in her path, so we'll see here, she pauses and leans to left and right, and then before she actually chooses to go to the left. I've slowed it down there so you can see it. And I can't but look at that and think that here's an animal who, although she had blind sight, was nonetheless aware of what she could see. See it. This is meant to be repeating, but let me do it again. Look at it again. I think, and I say it myself, this is an extraordinary piece of film. Helen is cognitively conscious, although she will certainly has no sensations. I'll give you another example. Perhaps it's not quite as convincing, but nonetheless, let's look at it. When Helen saw something which was out of reach, as you'll see, she kind of hesitates. She knows she can't reach it until she finally tries. We found this at the very end of a piece of film I made. But here again is an animal who has introspective knowledge of what she can and can't see. At least I find that convincing. I've been using the word chooses here. She's choosing when to reach or when to move to left or right. But presumably Helen could only choose between alternatives if in fact she was consciously aware of them. And in that case, blind sight is even more of a surprise than Wisecrantz and I first thought. It's a case of insentient conscious vision. It's not a totally unconscious vision, insentient vision, but vision which actually is accessible to the subject. Well, you may think that's not the story which has been told about human patients with blind sight. It's been said that they're totally unconscious. But actually, that's not so. Increasingly, clinicians have been arguing and claiming that sorry, I go back from that for a moment, that blind sight patients do have some kind of understanding. They have sense that there's something out there, even if they're not aware of it at the level of sensations. And here I want to show you a clip from one very extraordinary patient. This is a patient called TN, who was studied by B. de Gelder in Belgium, in Brussels, a few years ago. And I went out to visit her to watch her make observations on this patient. He was a man from Rwanda. He is exceptional in so far as he has total blind sight. Both sides of his visual cortex were destroyed in successive strokes, but just the visual cortex. So he's a very extraordinary and unique patient. And I think perhaps very revealing because he has total blind sight like Helen did, not like most other cases have, which is only in half the visual field. Now, look at this demonstration. So I should have explained he's seeing this demonstration going on the laptop. Unlike most blind sight patients, he spontaneously points at it. He knows he can see it, and he's saying in French, for those of you who don't follow it, look, he's walking to the left. So he's walking to the left of the screen. What's more, he's walking, but he's not moving. I mean, this is a very sophisticated observation to make for somebody who has no visual sensations. This is a kind of blind sight which hasn't been described before. And what's more, he also shows a similar capacity in relation to color vision. Now, this just shouldn't be happening according to the classical view of blindsight. Alan Kai and Petra Sterling showed that blindsight patients' DB can in fact tell colors, but only when they're asked to guess. They never spontaneously say, oh, it's red, this is the red one, of course, as he's clearly doing. So I think what we're onto now is a new description of blindsight. Blindsight is insentient, but nonetheless cognitively conscious vision. And I think that means the story has to be rewritten, and what the contribution of blindsight is to our understanding has yet really to be worked out. Okay, I'm going to leave it there. I'm sorry, probably gone on, not on an hour, and after that break, I'm not so ashamed to have overrun. Let's move on to discussion, unless there's some bit of film you want me to show you again. I haven't talked about this latest idea about cognitively conscious blindsight before, and I haven't written anything about it. So since you can say you heard it here first,